I think one of the interesting things, and one of the reasons why we showed that short clip before, is because it tells you a little bit about how it came to be that the anniversary demonstrations in the last, on the 25th itself, were, and I expect many of you have seen the pictures, were absolutely huge. Certainly from my experience, I was there for 9 days during the 18 days, and I was there a couple of days ago as well on the anniversary demonstration. Tahir and the areas around it were as full on the 25th of January this year as they were at any point during the 18 days, with the possible exception of the night when Mubarak fell. But to be honest, that was a different character of event altogether. And I think what the clip shows you is where those people come from, where they're mobilised from. I think one of the myths about, one of the things that's travelled about the Egyptian revolution is the idea of occupying the square. It's become an international inspiration, obviously, to the Occupy movement itself. But the whole point about Tahrir was it was never simply occupied. It was the destination that marches from all around Cairo headed to. It was the end point of the famous A to B demonstrations. And it shows you a little bit about, and as it was again on the 25th, people will tour the local areas, will pull together a demonstration from early in the morning. Many of those demonstrations don't even set off until midday or early afternoon. Virtually none of them, 2 days ago, arrived in Tahrir Square before about 3 or 4 in the afternoon, and they were absolutely huge, and they came from all over the city. There was one that left Heliopolis right out by the airport and came in, joining other demonstrations all the way through the day, and only really arrived in Tahrir late in the afternoon. The one that was coming over the Khazri O'Neill Bridge from Docking stretched back for kilometres back. There was one point where the head of it was in Tahrir Square, and not even the back of it was still over by the Opera House, which is on the other side of the Nile, something like 2 kilometres away. And that happens because the Tahrir demonstrations are an expression of a much deeper process of mobilisation that's going on in the society. And one of the reasons why the Kazaboon film is interesting is because it shows you a little bit about how that's done. That was a film showing in the street in Imbaba, which is one of the poor areas, the poor working class areas of Cairo. And it's shown in the street, by the way, because anybody who's got the internet, who's on Facebook, will have already seen this film. Will have already seen the film of the woman being dragged around the streets by the security forces. Will have already seen the film of them running down people and brutalising people in the square. But what the revolutionaries found is, of course, what's always been true, that it was never simply a Twitter or a Facebook revolution. And of course, there are millions of Egyptians who are nowhere near having access to that kind of media. So showing the film in the street like that has become one of the ways of getting that argument about the nature of the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, the SCAF regime, out to a much wider audience. People I was talking to in Egypt 2 days ago said that on one occasion some of the activists had been arrested. A group of people went to the police station where they were being held to argue for them to be released. They got into an argument with the police officers inside the station, who eventually agreed that they would show Kazaboon inside the police station, and that you know, is always obviously happening down at Paddington Green. I mean, we regularly show left-wing films down there, obviously. But you can see what's going on in the society for that kind of thing to be happening, and that's where the mobilisation came from. And I think you know, you were quite right in the introduction when you said that it's a process. And I guess really what I want to talk about is where that process is. Because the events of the last couple of days are another watershed, I believe, another turning point in the development of the process that is the Egyptian revolution. And I think it's quite right to think about what the regime was like before the fall of Mubarak. But I think it's also important to concentrate on what the forces were at that point during the 18 days. And I think one of the first things that we wrote about it on Counterfire, in fact, it is the opening sentence of the book that Joseph Daha and I wrote, is a quotation from Frederick Engels when he says that every revolution begins as the revolution of the flowers. And what he meant by that is that at the beginning of a revolutionary process, you have, almost by definition for a revolution to start, an incredibly isolated regime, socially isolated, not just from the working population and the poor population, but isolated also from layers of the middle class, from layers of the peasantry, from even its own most immediate supporters within the regime itself, are beginning to think that this isn't working, that there's something systemically wrong with the way in which the regime works. And that's why you can have a fantastically rapid advance of a revolution in a few days, a regime that's seemingly been absolutely monolithic, absolutely stable, more than capable of repressing its opposition over decades, is wiped away, well, in the Egyptian case, in 18 days. That can only happen if the regime against which the revolution is moving is already decayed from within, is already half a husk, half to the point where it can be blown away. And that's what happened during the 18 days. As you said, the whole of the Egyptian society seemed to mobilise, very large sections of the middle class, very large sections of the intelligentsia, and ultimately, of course, one of the reasons why Mubarak went is that the people who were just like Mubarak in the regime decided we're going to sacrifice him, because if we don't sacrifice him now, today, the rest of us will be gone tomorrow. And that's what that was the nature of the fall of the Mubarak regime in many ways. The protests obviously were absolutely central to it. The growing, this didn't happen until quite late in the 18 days, but in the last 2 or 3 days, the level of strikes and industrial unrest grew very, very rapidly. But also the army began to fragment, or perhaps not fragment, but to fray. You know, on the very last afternoon before Mubarak fell, I was on the demonstration on that day. The demonstrations began to move out from Tahrir to the presidential palace, to the Abdin Palace, to Maspero, the state television, was identified and still is identified. Still today the protests are there because it's identified as a mainstay of the regime. And I was about 3 ranks back as we broke through the barrier, simply ripped it up, the demonstration simply ripped it up, and there were 4 tanks which we simply ran between, we simply filed between, and the soldiers just stood on top of the tanks with the submachine guns in their arms like this. Now, that was great for us, but I know what the military high command are thinking. They're thinking, oh my God, if they let them run between the tanks and don't do anything today, if this goes on for 2 more days, they'll be jumping down off the tanks and joining them. And it's at that point, and there were middle-ranking military officers in uniform already into Tahrir at that point. Now, when a regime has got mass protests in their millions, which simply aren't going to go away, when there's increasing labour unrest, and when it looks like the armed forces are fragmenting, and by the way, the revolution has already destroyed the initial layer of the armed forces, the central security forces and the police in the first 4 days of the revolution, that's when they decide they're going to sacrifice the figurehead in order to try and stabilise the rule of the rest of the people in the ruling class. And that's what happened in January and February, and the situation that's existed ever since then has been a kind of sometimes more or less static, sometimes more or less fast-moving war of position between the remnant of the Mubarak regime government, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces and its supporting elements, and the revolutionary movement that, for the sake of argument, we'll call Tahrir. Although it exists all over Europe, all over Egypt, although it's not limited by any means to Tahrir, but the forces that are represented by Tahrir. And the argument has been, the central argument of the government, supported most of the time by the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the single biggest opposition organisation under Mubarak, has the deepest roots of any opposition organisation, and therefore had the most to gain from a quick set of elections, was willing to go along with the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, both in the referendum which set up this process earlier in the year, and more or less with its timetable all the way through. Now, I mean, it's worth saying at this point, I mean, you always have to say, you shouldn't have to say this, but it's always necessary to do so, particularly in Europe, but still to some people who are liberal secularists in Egypt itself. When you talk about the Muslim Brotherhood, you're talking about a political current. You're not talking fundamentally about an institution which, although it's obviously connected to a particular religious belief, can be defined in that way. Let me put it like this. When we talk about the Christian Democrats in Italy, we're not talking about all Italian Christians, obviously. We're talking about a particular political formation which has links to the Catholic Church, but isn't by any means representative of all Catholics in Italy. When we're talking about the Muslim Brotherhood, we're obviously talking about an institution which is partly religiously defined, but is in essence a political program, a political organisation, and obviously so when it formed a political party to compete against others in the election. And as such, it doesn't represent all Muslims. It certainly doesn't represent all revolutionaries. It represents a particular political view about what should happen in the Egyptian revolution, and by and large, one which was allied throughout this year to the main elements of the SCAF political programme. The SCAF political programme was, we want a quick transition to some form of democracy which will put a veneer on the old order and allow business to continue more or less as usual, with the same people owning the land, with the same people running the factories, with the same people, insofar as we can get away with it, in positions of power within the state. And the Egyptian army is a unique institution in this sense, because it's not like the army in this country. It's not simply the armed forces of the state. It is a huge economic actor in its own right. It owns bottled water plants, it owns cement factories, it builds white goods, it owns motorway construction. It is both part of the capitalist class and the armed forces of the capitalist class at the same time in the same institution. So when you're attacking SCAF, you're not just attacking this kind of military defence of the system, you're also attacking something which is right at the core economically of the system as well, which is why it's such a tough battle, which is why they're an entrenched and central part of the ruling operation, and that's why they're determined to try and hang on to as much of the power as they possibly can. So what's happened is the conflict between these two elements in the revolution, and this is what happens in all revolutions. After the moment of the overthrow of the old order, of its most significant political figures, there's a process of political differentiation. Different political forces, different political programs, different class forces, different institutions, different perspectives in the revolution then begin to compete with each other to define what the revolution is really about. And some of those forces want to stop the revolution almost as soon as it started. And that's what quite a large section of the people around SCAF and around the Muslim Brotherhood want to do. They're saying, okay, that's enough. We've got rid of Mubarak, we are going to have some form of democracy, and that's it. Go home. Stop protesting, stop striking, stop carrying on about a fast transition to democracy. You've had enough, go home. That's been really the message of the SCAF government all the way through the year, and very often it's been echoed by the Muslim Brotherhood. Not always, but very often it's been echoed by the Muslim Brotherhood as well. The argument has been repeatedly, again and again, that Egypt is not to hear. That these people in the square, they're a minority, they don't represent the whole of Egyptian society, there are very, very many people who have faith in the armed forces, they're causing trouble, they're pushing the economy to a disaster, we've had enough of the lack of security, it's got to stop. That's been the repeated message again and again from the government, from the state TV, on and on and on all year. And not without effect, not without some effect either, and the ability of the military to sometimes brutally suppress demonstrations, the Women's Day demonstration on the 8th of March, the COP demonstration outside Maspero, again and again, often in Tahrir itself, again and again to do that is because there's some truth to it. A revolution affects the broadest mass of the population differentially. Not everybody is radicalised at the same speed. Not everybody draws the same conclusions at the same time. There are some people who are supporters of the regime, just like there's a third of the working class in this country that always votes Tory. Don't ask me why, but it does. Who are never convinced of a progressive